The wind cut through the barren plains like a sharpened blade, rattling the sparse wooden fences of the lone ranch and sweeping snow across the frozen ground. John McAllister, the solitary rancher, trudged along the path to his cabin, his boots sinking into icy drifts. His breath puffed out in thick clouds, and his hands ached despite the thick gloves he wore. He had spent the entire day tending to his small herd, repairing broken fences, and hauling hay through the relentless winter cold. The isolation of the Montana plains had become second nature to him, yet the bitter wind gnawed at his resolve, reminding him that the world was vast, harsh, and indifferent. As he approached the cabin, a flicker of movement in the distance caught his eye. At first, he thought it was a stray animal, perhaps a coyote or a wandering dog, but then he saw a figure stumbling through the snow. She was a woman, her clothes thin and worn, and her small frame shivering violently against the gusting wind. Her dark hair whipped across her face, and her eyes, wide with fear and exhaustion, locked onto his. "May I sleep in your cabin, sir?" she called, her voice trembling yet oddly melodic. "It's freezing outside." Her accent was unfamiliar, hinting at distant lands far beyond the Rockies, a voice from a world John had only ever glimpsed in books and fleeting travelers' tales. John paused, instinct and caution warring with compassion. Strangers on these plains could bring trouble, and the thought of harboring one unsettled him. But something in her eyes, the desperate need for warmth, the quiet dignity amid her suffering, softened his resolve. He nodded, keeping his hand on the rifle slung across his shoulder more out of habit than suspicion. "All right," he said, his voice steady but low. "Follow my rules. You stay inside, and you don't touch my things." Relief washed over her features, and she hurried forward, her movements stiff from cold. Inside the cabin, John set to work lighting the fire, the flames slowly pushing back the chill. The small wooden walls seemed to grow warmer with each flicker, and the scent of smoke mingled with the faint aroma of dried meat stored in the corner. He offered her a simple meal of bread and stew, and she accepted it gratefully, her hands trembling as she ate. She introduced herself as Mei Lin, speaking carefully, choosing her words in a language that was both foreign and beautiful to John's ears. She explained that she had been traveling alone, separated from her companions while crossing the continent, and that the bitter winter had left her with no choice but to seek shelter. John watched her closely, the way she folded her hands, the grace in her movements despite her obvious exhaustion, and the determination that shone through her every action. That night, as she curled near the fire, John found himself staring into the flames, realizing that this chance encounter had disrupted the rhythm of his solitary life. The world outside was still frozen and relentless, but inside the cabin, there was warmth, safety, and the quiet beginnings of a connection neither of them could yet name. The wind howled beyond the wooden walls, but for the first time in years, John did not feel entirely alone. Morning broke with a pale light filtering through the frost-covered windows, casting long shadows across the cabin's wooden floor. John McAllister stood by the door, squinting against the brightness, while Mei Lin wrapped herself in a thin blanket, shivering from the cold that still clung to her bones. Outside, the wind had died down, but the air remained sharp and biting. The snow crunched beneath their boots as they stepped into the open plains, tending to the few animals that had survived the harsh winter nights. Mei Lin followed John closely, her movements careful yet surprisingly precise. She had never handled livestock before, but she asked questions with curiosity and observed every action with a sharp intelligence that impressed John more than he expected. John moved through his daily routines with mechanical precision, but he noticed how quickly Mei Lin adapted. She helped him fill the troughs with water, scatter feed, and mend a section of broken fence, her small hands strong and steady. At one point, she slipped in the mud, her feet flailing, and let out a light, musical laugh that echoed across the empty plains. John paused, watching her with a mixture of surprise and amusement. The sound was unexpected, like sunlight breaking through a long, gray winter. Her laughter warmed him in a way he hadn't felt in years, and for a moment, the lonely ranch didn't feel quite so desolate. As the day wore on, they returned to the cabin for a simple lunch of bread and dried meat. Mei Lin spoke cautiously, sharing fragments of her life. She described her village in southern China, the rivers and hills, the bustling streets filled with people and markets, and the lessons her parents had taught her about resilience and survival. Her English was hesitant at times, but her voice carried a melodic clarity, painting vivid pictures of a world far removed from the cold plains of Montana. John listened, intrigued despite himself. He rarely shared stories with anyone, and yet, in the quiet warmth of the cabin, he found himself speaking of his own past, of his father's ranch, the endless winters, and the isolation that had defined his life. Though their words were limited, a subtle understanding began to form. Mei Lin's eyes sparkled with intelligence and determination, and John saw in her a strength that mirrored his own, tempered by vulnerability. They worked together, laughed together, and shared silences that spoke louder than any conversation. Even in the simplicity of daily chores, a bond was forming, rooted in necessity but growing into something deeper, unspoken, and undeniable. As the sun dipped low, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, John realized that Mei Lin's presence had shifted something within him. She was no longer just a guest seeking shelter, she was becoming a part of the life he had meticulously carved from isolation. The plains remained harsh, the wind still unforgiving, but for the first time in years, John felt a flicker of warmth that had nothing to do with the fire inside the cabin. And as they walked back to tend the last of the animals, side by side, he understood that this unexpected encounter might change his world forever. Weeks passed, and winter's relentless grip began to ease, though the plains remained cold and unforgiving. Snowstorms still swept across the horizon, but the worst had passed, leaving behind frozen ground melting slowly into muddy streams. John McAllister moved through his days with practiced routine, tending his small herd and repairing fences, yet the cabin no longer felt like the solitary refuge it had once been. Mei Lin had settled into ranch life with surprising ease. She learned quickly, her delicate frame belying the strength and determination she displayed in every task. She helped feed the cattle, patch fences, and even handle the stubborn horses that had long been John's pride and occasional frustration. Their days were long and exhausting, but the harshness of labor was softened by the growing companionship between them. Mei Lin's laughter, soft and musical, often broke through the monotony, reminding John that life did not have to be endured alone. She asked questions about everything, the land, the animals, the routines of ranch life, and absorbed his answers with keen attention. John found himself explaining things he had long taken for granted, and in doing so, discovered an unexpected joy in sharing knowledge with someone who truly appreciated it. One evening, as a blizzard raged outside, John and Mei Lin huddled near the fire, listening to the wind batter the cabin walls. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows that danced across their faces. Mei Lin spoke quietly of her fears, of the endless journey she had undertaken to reach this place, of the moments she had thought she would never survive the cold or the loneliness. John listened intently, realizing how much she had endured with quiet resilience. In turn, he shared fragments of his own fears, admitting for the first time how lonely the ranch had made him feel, how he had resigned himself to a life without companionship, without connection. As the storm intensified outside, John instinctively pulled her closer, a protective gesture that neither had anticipated. The warmth of her presence seeped into him, replacing the chill that had long been a constant companion. For a brief moment, they sat in silence, the only sounds the wind outside and the crackling of the fire, yet the connection between them was palpable. It was more than survival, it was trust, a fragile bond built on shared hardships and mutual respect, beginning to blossom into something neither fully understood yet. When morning came, the storm had subsided, leaving a pristine layer of snow glistening in the soft light of dawn. Together, they stepped outside, leaving footprints side by side across the untouched landscape. Each step seemed symbolic, a trail marking the start of a journey not just across the frozen plains, but through a growing understanding between them. John glanced at Mei Lin, her face illuminated by the pale sun, and realized that the desperate plea she had uttered weeks ago had led to something far greater than shelter. It had sparked a connection, a bond forged in adversity, trust, and the unspoken promise that neither of them would face the harshness of the world alone again. Spring finally arrived, bringing a hesitant warmth to the plains. The snow melted into muddy streams, and the first shoots of green pushed through the frozen soil. John McAllister and Mei Lin stepped outside each morning to greet a world slowly waking from winter's harsh grip. Mei Lin had become indispensable, her hands deft at tasks she had once never imagined performing. She tilled the soil, helped repair fences, and tended to the animals with an ease that surprised John daily. Her presence brought a new rhythm to the ranch, a gentle balance to the solitude that had defined his life for so long. As the days lengthened, their conversations grew deeper. Mei Lin would ask about the stars, the weather, the land itself, and John found himself explaining the patterns of life on the ranch with more patience than he had ever shown before. She listened intently, eyes wide with curiosity, absorbing everything as though she were mapping a new world. John, a man of few words, discovered the joy of storytelling, of passing down knowledge and history. With her, even mundane chores, milking cows, mending fences, or hauling hay, felt lighter, the work shared and somehow more meaningful. One afternoon, while repairing the roof of the barn, John slipped on a slick patch of wood, his hands losing their grip. Mei Lin reacted instantly, grabbing his arm with a surprising strength that belied her delicate appearance. Their eyes met, and for a long moment, time seemed to pause. Gratitude, admiration, and something unspoken flickered between them, a silent acknowledgement of trust and reliance. John realized that she was no longer merely a guest or even a companion, she had become a partner in the rhythms of his life, a presence he had come to depend on without even recognizing it. As the sun dipped low, casting a warm golden hue across the plains, Mei Lin paused near the fence, brushing her fingers against the growing shoots of spring grass. She spoke softly, almost to herself, about the fears she had carried through winter, the fear of being lost, alone, and powerless, and how the ranch had become a sanctuary she never thought she would find. John listened quietly, heart stirred in ways he had not expected. He admitted, reluctantly at first, that he had also feared the isolation, that life had felt empty and monotonous until she arrived. Her courage and resilience had reminded him of his own, and her presence had filled the emptiness he had accepted as inevitable. That evening, as they walked together across the warming fields, the ranch bathed in the soft light of dusk, John realized how profoundly Mei Lin had changed his world. The cabin no longer represented mere shelter from the elements, it was now a home filled with laughter, shared labor, and the quiet comfort of companionship. The loneliness he had long considered unshakable was now tempered by her presence. Each glance, each word, and each gesture had built a fragile yet undeniable bond between them. A connection born of adversity, nurtured through trust, and strengthened by the promise of life shared side by side. The plains still stretched wide and empty beyond the cabin, but with Mei Lin at his side, John felt that he was no longer alone, and the future, once bleak and uncertain, now held a glimmer of hope. Summer arrived in full force, transforming the plains into a patchwork of golden green. The rivers swelled with melted snow, wildflowers nodded in the warm breeze, and the animals thrived under John McAllister and Mei Lin's careful attention. The ranch, once a lonely outpost on the edge of the world, now buzzed with life and the quiet hum of shared labor. Mei Lin moved through the fields with ease, her hands strong from months of hard work, yet her movements retained a grace that captivated John more than he cared to admit. She had become indispensable, not just for the ranch but for him, her presence filling the emptiness he had long considered inevitable. Their days were long and demanding, yet neither noticed the hours pass when they worked together. Mei Lin laughed often, a sound that had become as vital to John as the sunrise itself. They repaired fences side by side, guided stubborn horses into pens, and harvested crops that now promised a bountiful season. With every shared task, their bond deepened, moving beyond gratitude or companionship into something unspoken yet undeniable. They had learned each other's rhythms, anticipating needs and actions with an ease that came only from trust and time spent together. One evening, after the day's work was done, John suggested they walk along the river that curved gently through the property. The water sparkled under the fading light, reflecting the sky's soft oranges and purples. Mei Lin paused on the riverbank, letting the wind play with her hair, and looked at John with a quiet vulnerability. She whispered, almost shyly, that she had never imagined finding a place like this, a place of safety, warmth, and stability, or someone like him, who had welcomed her without hesitation. Her voice carried a mixture of awe and gratitude, and John felt his chest tighten at the sincerity in her eyes. He took a deep breath, realizing how much her presence had changed him. The loneliness, the rigid self-reliance that had defined him for years, had softened in ways he could never have anticipated. He admitted, quietly, that her courage, her resilience, and her unwavering optimism had breathed life into a world he had accepted as harsh and unforgiving. For the first time, he recognized that he had not only survived alongside her but had come to care for her deeply, in ways that went far beyond mere companionship. As the moon rose high above the plains, Casting silver light across the gently flowing river, they stood together in silence. The wind whispered through the grass, carrying the scent of summer blooms, and the water reflected their entwined shadows. Words were unnecessary, their bond was evident in every glance, every shared smile, and every quiet moment of understanding. Mei Lin's plea for shelter, uttered in desperation months ago, had led to the creation of something far greater, a life shared, a connection forged in adversity, and a hope for the future neither had dared to imagine. John looked at Mei Lin and realized that the bitter cold she had escaped had not only brought her to him but had also led him to her. Together, they had transformed isolation into home, solitude into companionship, and hardship into a promise that the plains, though still vast and wild, were no longer empty. They were no longer two strangers thrown together by fate, they were partners, bound by shared struggle, trust, and the quiet certainty that, whatever came next, they would face it together.